give it another minute or two for some more folks to join. I know a few folks aren't able to make it today. All right, let me just make sure I have the notes here.
That's a private meeting, isn't it? We're just three of us.
Yeah. So we could probably end it quite quickly. I know a lot of folks have been. Oh, go ahead.
No, I agree.
Yeah, let me just change the notes just so that folks know that we did have a meeting. It just it ended pretty early. I know that there's starting to be this like all day SLSA 1.0. Let's squash all the
Yes.
outstanding issue stuff. So I was probably gonna right after this anyway start heading over to that meeting. Oh, it looks like a few more folks might be joining, but 1 second.
Well, they showed up because I had the agenda in another window and saw you typing.
Yeah, well, just so that folks know that, hey, we did have the meeting, feel free to.
It's IBM and Mike.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we could probably just very quickly just sort of go over here. You know, the main things is there is, if in the tracking issue for 1.0, Frederick did created npm tracking issue for 1.0. It's also yeah, so I'm also looking to maybe make a quick and dirty sort of SLSA 1.0 provenance format validator, probably in something like Go, but I was looking at maybe updating, a while back I had made one in Q, the Q language, and which is very useful for this sort of thing. The problem is Q, as far as I can tell, still doesn't have some support for like certain things like URL validation and those sorts of things. So I might just end up writing something quickly in something like Go in a little bit. But yeah, and I'm also trying to talk with some of the SLSA, because there's the SLSA verifier folks, and like, hey, does it make sense to just pull out the spec elements from there into something like a library, and so that other folks can just sort of include that without necessarily needing to include the entire verifier, because for some folks it's just like, hey, I'm generating salsa provenance and I just want to know, I just want to validate that I'm actually following the spec correctly, which is always we're already noticing it's a pretty common issue. It's like even with like SPDX and Cyclone DX, a lot of tools that are generating it like generate mostly conforming to the spec, but they miss a few things here, or they add stuff in like certain, certain types don't line up, which then leads to all sorts of problems downstream for clients and consumers. So yeah, that's about it. Does anybody else have any
By
updates?
the way, so Q is new to me, but I don't tend to be a reference as to, the newer languages. And I mean, is that fairly popular? How commonly used it is?
It's growing in popularity. So Q is not like a programming language. It's like it's like a data language. So the idea is it can do stuff like generate data. It can validate data against like a specification. And it has a nice like hierarchical sort of way that you can sort of say, hey, I have something, let's say salsa spec, but for me, I want to also put additional constraints on it. Like the naming of this thing should always look like this. And you can sort of enforce that on there. And so from that perspective, it's actually really, really nice. One of my primary comments to the creators of the language is some of the documentation and some of the stuff involved in it feels a little like, because it's made by some of the folks who made the Borg configuration language for Google, and it feels very like academic in some spaces, where it's like sometimes I'm just like, how do I just validate a URL? And they're like, well, that makes it impure or whatever. And it's like, okay, well, I have a use case here. Like even if there's like another way of doing it, I need to know like how to do that. Anyway, that's really it is growing in popularity because of like for example, Istio uses Q, I believe, to generate their API. Some others use it as well. Fresca uses it. Who else? It is growing in popularity. The problem is, I think it's been a while since there's been not an update, but since the release of Q. So there's supposed to be a Q 0.5, I think, coming out. But yeah, like there is a release branch for 0.5 that got cut on February 2nd, but it hasn't officially been released yet. And that's pretty much the first release in about a year. To be clear, there's been a lot of beta development, and they're trying to obviously when it comes to a language, it's a little different than, I don't know, just like a little tool where you might expect the little tool to get updated every month or something like that. But yeah, it's also the release of it has been pushed back quite a few times. I like Q a lot. I just think it needs maybe a bit more TLC, as they say, especially around documentation. Their documentation is not particularly great. Some of it is, yes.
Developers are better at writing code than documentation. So.
Yeah, well, it's funny because in what was it, KubeCon in last year, KubeCon North America in Detroit, they had somebody who was like, hey, I'm now the head of community. What's the biggest, things that you want? Everybody's like, better documentation, better examples, better yada yada. And I think they're prepping all of that for the 0.5 release. I just think it's not quite there yet, especially since if I go to the website, some of the areas of the documentation say like last updated, 2019, 2020, 2021. A lot has changed since then. Let me see here. Well, some of it is, 2022, but still. Anyway,
Anyway, that's
yeah.
good. I mean, I was wondering. I know you seem to like it. You used it for Fresca. That's how I heard about it. But
Yeah,
I have
I
not
think
had any exposure to it so far. So that's why I was wondering if it was something I missed or what.
yeah, it's sort of a long-term. So certain policy engines are looking at Q as a mechanism as well for configuration. A few others are looking at stuff like that. I think the main thing, more so than necessarily Q itself, I think the thing that folks are very interested in is they want something like, because I don't know if anybody's familiar with K-Sonnet or J-Sonnet. Back when folks were looking at Helm charts and looking at stuff, like one of the big issues that's still a big issue is templating in Helm charts is not necessarily the nicest, and templating in general is not necessarily the nicest. And sometimes you want to be able to generate data without necessarily needing to delve into like, oh, let me use Go or let me use Python to generate that data. And then you end up in situations where, why is this thing not halting? Or, that sort of problem. And so Q is supposed to help out with that. And that's kind of where a lot of that, I think, came from was can we have something that is a simpler language that allows folks to not inadvertently shoot themselves in the foot when developing and generating configuration and stuff like that. And you need something a bit more powerful than templating, where when you start to do like nested loops and nested if statements and templating, it just becomes a real nasty mess. Cool.
Okay,
So
but the reason also I was asking is because I know that for Fresca you've been looking for other people to contribute, and I wonder if this is going to be a barrier for people to jump in because they're not familiar with it.
Yeah, so actually one of the things, and I'm writing this up in the write-up for Fresca as well, is I'm totally open with switching off of Q to something else if a bunch of other folks come in and say, hey, why don't we look at this stat or the other thing? So definitely looking at that. And then in addition to that, I think the thing, we probably only need a couple of folks who actually know Q, maybe like one or two people, but because I think a lot of it can just be, I would like, one of the things that I had emailed a few folks about was, I think the big thing is more like not necessarily the language that's important, just making the usability for the end user simple, and whether the backing thing is Q or something else is sort of whatever to me. Just I think for the end user, the thing that we want to make sure is we don't want end users to have to say, hey, I wrote a bunch of Tecton config plus a bunch of Keyverno config plus a bunch of Spiffy Spire and Vault config and so on and so forth. If there's some way to say, like, the big goal is to say it's all one deployable unit, so that when somebody comes up with a new pipeline or whatever, it's not like they have to think about these 50 things. It's just like a simple interface there. I know Brendan, I know he hasn't done a whole lot with the Q, but on the Fresca side, but I know that's another thing there. So I noticed a few other folks joined, just to kind of give the thing. So for SLSA, we're still pushing for 1.0. I believe there is supposed to be a Friday all-day meeting here. One second.
Beginning of the all-day meeting?
So no, this is not the all-day meeting. There's supposed to be an all-day meeting for specification. Mark is supposed to send some stuff out, but he just sent something a couple of minutes ago saying that he's not feeling well today, so he might take the day. So maybe not today. But today, this is just the SLSA tooling piece. His thing was more the specification stuff, and so we wanted to squash some of that. But the big, not a whole lot has changed on the 1.0 stuff. There's a bunch of tracking issues for like NPM and for Tecton and Tecton chains, and some of the other tools out there that are planning to support SLSA 1.0. There's a tracking issue within SLSA, tracking all those tracking issues in the other the downstream projects. There's another thing just around looking at like either taking some of the stuff from the existing like SLSA verifier that we have or similar and just pulling out the actual validator, the format spec validation piece into something like its own library so that we can, so that folks can just sort of like import that as opposed to, there's a couple of different like libraries out there. We probably want to say, hey, here's the official SLSA one, so that folks can just sort of import that and be able to start, generating SLSA and verifying SLSA quite easily. And that's really about it. So we can, if anybody else,
what are the big things blocking the release?
Oh, so the release of 1.0, so this is the tooling meeting. So this is just more around like coordinating with the folks who are building SLSA tools to make sure that like, are you, SLSA compliant, and also saying like, developing stuff like, hey, can we help with some of the folks who are building like SLSA distribution mechanisms and yada yada, like what can we do on that front? So that's kind of what the purpose of this meeting is. And so with 1.0 coming out, we're just trying to make sure that if there's anything we need to do as a group to help support folks to support 1.0, but the SLSA specification piece itself, so it's currently in release candidate, it's looking for feedback. We've gotten some feedback, and so the only thing that's really stopping us from release is just waiting for the rest of the feedback and clearing up a couple of things, mostly around folks who are like a little like there's some language that might be a little unclear that we just need to make more crisp.
What is the status of GitHub's support of SLSA?
So
is that a discussion going on within the SLSA development team, or?
So GitHub officially supporting SLSA. I know there's some discussions about like SLSA just being something that could be inside of the GitHub system itself, as opposed to it being part of the GitHub reusable workflow, because we have a bunch of reusable workflows, and that hits the SLSA requirements. But there is sort of conversation about, could you make SLSA more of a first-class thing in GitHub? And I know that there's some discussions around that as well, but that's more of like an internal GitHub thing. But from the open source space, yeah, there's a bunch of stuff on that end. And then in addition, there's like NPM is supporting SLSA, and the idea of like allowing folks to push SLSA attestations in, or to also accept SLSA attestations from stuff like GitHub Actions and so on. And that's there's a tracking issue. So in these notes here, there is a tracking issue 574 in SLSA, and in 574 there is npm CLI 6268, which is the one that is supposed to track some of this supporting SLSA 1.0 inside of npm's CLI. Yeah. So and on that front, I think the main thing is just we've been reaching out just to see like, hey, is there anybody who needs any help with anything? So far, it's been pretty quiet. On the npm side, I believe folks from npm and GitHub are actively working on that. But yeah, that's about it as far as I'm aware.
Makes sense.
Yeah. And beyond that, there's not a whole lot. I think the idea was also, if there's other tools that folks wanted, they could definitely sort of throw stuff in the notes, and then we can see, if anybody has any time to work on them, or if there's features that are in the official Salsa stuff that, or rather, if there are feature requests or bug fixes or whatever in the official Salsa tools, like the GitHub workflow and some of those things, we can work on that as well.
I don't know that I would call that the official.
Well, the stuff that falls under, I guess, the Salsa.
That is supported or developed by.
Yeah, supported. Yeah, it's developed by us. Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, because that's actually been a problem I have with this is, how do we position it? Because you talk about the GitHub. So there is this, GitHub action Salsa generator thing. And I expect that eventually GitHub will define their own way of doing this. And maybe it is also an action that you can just use. And then it's like, what's the status? How do you explain to people which is which and who? So we have to be careful how we position those things, because if there is one from GitHub, that will be the official one.
Yes, correct. Sorry, yeah. I agree.
It's all right. I know what you meant, but I think it is good to clarify so that people get used to the idea that we don't have an official.
Yeah. We might have a couple of implementations and examples of things, but they're not necessarily like we don't want folks to think that this is the one way of doing it. And in fact, there might be multiple ways, and in fact, there might be even within GitHub, right? GitHub might have some sort of like, I'm just saying, like GitHub might say, hey, our official mechanism is, only for enterprise customers or whatever. But like, there might be lots of different ways of going about that. It makes sense.
And there's another one that's like Mark has contributed one for the cloud build and the Google Cloud.
Yes.
When I discussed it with him, I'm like, what's the status of this? It should be in Google. And he's like, well, it's just my thing. I don't know if they even approve it in Google Cloud.
There's a.
So it's the same. Eventually, the Google Cloud will want to have control of it and not necessarily go through OpenSSF, and they'll find their own, and that will be the official one. So
that's a. Yes. Very good point. That's an ongoing thing. I don't want to put anybody on blast, but it is a fairly common thing among the Google open source team that's just like, hey, I threw this thing out there. And it's like, oh, okay. We don't want to give folks the wrong thought, because there's I know some folks have already said, hey, some folks have said they can use the official GitHub actions, stuff that is officially maintained by GitHub, but they're not authorized to use anything under SSF. Yeah. And so it's like, I get that, but there's also a thing of, hey, that would be up to GitHub as to whether or not they want to then, like, let's say, fork what we've built and maintain it themselves. And
exactly.
And I know that's one of the things too, that is one of the things we're trying to clear up in the specification. And it's something I've been writing up myself to try and help folks clarify that, like, what does the build system completely mean? And the build system can mean also stuff like, because I think we've clarified where build service is different than build system, where build service is a running instance of I'm going to say a build components, and then the build system is the complete package that you would sort of say an end user can use in order to interact with Salsa, which is also complicated because some folks, right, like the whole thing with Fresca, right, is Tecton and Tecton chains, if you use it the correct way, get you up to Salsa 2. Adding in Spiffy Spire gets you to Salsa 3. But for a lot of folks, it's like, well, oh, does that mean Tecton is Salsa 3? Well, no, Tecton plus this configured the right way is Salsa 3. Okay, so it's really that whole package, And also when we look at stuff like potentially SLSA 4, and in certain cases SLSA 3 for certain folks, right? Like for certain build services, it is easy to just be like, oh, I didn't give it a way to sign, so it didn't sign anything, and so it's actually only SLSA 1. But that's on the end user to say, hey, and so how do you sort of wrap that all up and say, well, no, this is a SLSA 3 build system, and so it's not just using GitHub Actions or this, that, and the other thing. It's using it in this way means it's SLSA 3 or SLSA 2.
That would be a nice blog post, Mike.
Yeah, it's I have some notes along with I have the
Because
I mean,
when SLSA 1.0 is published, people will say, okay, how do I use this stuff, right?
Yep.
So
Yep.
I think providing this kind of information would be definitely useful.
Yep. And this is on a separate note, but if folks are interested, I have this other blog article around the breadth and depth of SLSA, just trying to kind of explain why we focused purely on the build and not source. And the idea being we plan to work on source, but we're taking a bit of a different approach than some of the other folks who, hey, we're saying no, we're keeping our scope small and then expanding out a little bit on the fringes to say what are the inputs, what are the outputs, and doing that sort of thing to say security. But anyway, doing some stuff on that end, and then one of the other things is writing up a blog on, hey, what really is a SLSA build system, and trying to say that, hey, it's actually, and the definition does a good job of it. I think the definition does a good job of explaining it to folks who understand a lot about build systems, but they don't do a very good job at explaining it to folks who are just like, hey, I'm an end user of this thing. Can I just use my Jenkins? And it's like, well, no, it has to be a Jenkins that's configured in the right ways. And but yeah, that's a good point, and I'll add that into some of my notes here. Oh, nice. One second. Cool. So yeah, that's I guess about it. If anybody has any other questions, or if anybody has anything else on that front, feel free to reach out to me about some of this. One of the things I'm trying to still do is I'm trying to get some of the folks who, one of the problems is I think Ian is the main contributor to, if I look at SLSA framework, I think the SLSA verifier is mostly maintained by Ian. I'll have to double check here. Oh no, it's maintained by Azra, who I believe is no longer on that team, but I'll double check. And also Ian, and the problem is Ian works in Japan, so there's like about an hour or two each day that there's any sort of overlap, so it's not the easiest to get a hold of him. Because I'll look through here and see if there's some way that we can pull out some of this. Oh, it looks like Laurent is also working on it. I could reach out to him. I know he works reasonable hours. But yeah, I think the big ones still are the library. The API stuff, I'm going to be reaching out to the securing software repos group to talk through with some of the folks who are like PyPI maintainers and gem maintainers, just to say, look, I think we all recognize that nobody is going to come in and say, here is the one API spec for everybody, and everybody should follow. This is how you distribute SLSA from a pack for packages. But I think if folks largely follow similar practices, or at least the majority of them follow similar practices, then when folks come in with clients for like verifier things and they say, hey, I want to pull down all attestations associated with this package in GEM or PyPI, we don't want to have to write completely different code and logic to do that. We want to just be able to say, I should be able to look up this on this endpoint and be able to pull that in, hopefully. So that's kind of, I think, the way we're trying to do that, but that's going to probably, based on some conversations, nobody has enough time to do it. So might need to come in with like, here's like a mostly baked spec or mostly baked best practices, and can folks just follow that and go from there. Anything else? Otherwise, we can end it like a half hour early. All right, cool.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah, I'll see everybody next week.
All right, thank you.
Have a good weekend, everybody.
Bye.